Hello, and welcome to CJPME's Debrief podcast, where we discuss breaking events and issues related to human rights in Palestine and the broader Middle East. Together, we make sense of events in the region and how people in Canada can respond. Today, we're going to be talking about Canada's voting on the 16 annual UN resolutions that relate to Palestine. What are these resolutions? Why do they come up every year? How does Canada vote? And more importantly, how does the rest of the world vote on these resolutions? And what, especially, can we expect from Canada this year? This podcast is a project of Canadians for Justice and Peace in the Middle East, CJPME, and seeks to advance its mission to empower Canadians of all backgrounds to promote justice, development, and peace in the Middle East. Today is Thursday, November 11th, and we are streaming live to YouTube, and will also be available on all the major podcast platforms. My name is Tom Woodley. I'm the president of CJPME and the podcast host for today. With me is Michael Buchert, CJPME's VP and our podcast co-host. Good morning, Michael.
Good morning. I guess it's good morning in Vancouver, but it's actually afternoon. But really happy to be here with you, to be live streaming, to be launching our brand new CJPME podcast, and to talk about some voting at the United Nations.
Absolutely. It's UN season again. And every November, we sort of see the same sort of thing, that there are a lot of resolutions being voted at the UN. And 16 of these resolutions each year relate to Palestine. And a lot of people, I don't think, necessarily understand why we have these resolutions every single year and what they're about. Why, Michael, why don't we just talk a bit, why do all these resolutions happen in sort of November, December? Why the timing?
Well, there's an annual cycle, and, November, December, this is when all of the major diplomats are in New York for United Nations meetings. This is when they come together to have speeches and to pass resolutions and to do the main business of the UN for that year. And so that's why all of a sudden at the end of the year, we find all of these votes start happening at the same time.
Yeah.
First at the committee level and then at a general plenary level.
Yeah. And in fact, the fall, basically every year, the fall is a busy time for all resolutions, not just those on Palestine. There's a lot going on. The rest of the year, quite often, is sort of quiet. There's plenty of committee and stuff work going on at the UN, but with these sort of big sessions, these big UN resolutions. Now, how many years has the UN been voting on these particular 16 resolutions that we'll be talking about today?
Well, it depends, but some of these resolutions have been debated every year for decades. I know that the one on Palestinian self-determination that we'll talk about later, I think Canada started voting for that in the late 1980s.
Yeah.
So there's a long, long history to these because they are about long-standing issues that haven't been resolved.
Yeah. And I guess there's a certain evolution of these resolutions over time, that they don't all have the same names. And there are changes. I remember after Israel invaded Lebanon in 2006, there were a few changes to some of the resolutions, and a few resolutions that related to Lebanon and Palestine at the same time. So they do evolve with current events and so on. So these 16 that we'll be talking about, how would you characterize them?
Well, they all in some way affirm Palestinian human rights or are critical of Israeli violations of human rights. Some of them are more symbolic. Some of them have more of a specific outcome, like creating a special committee to investigate Israeli violations, for example, or to renew the mandate for UN aid to refugees. But a lot of them are sort of affirming long-standing principles that Palestinian self-determination is something that the United Nations supports.
Yeah. There are 16, and we're not going to try to go through each of the 16 in detail here today. We will have a follow-up podcast in December after all the voting is done, and there we'll look at a little bit more in detail about each of the 16. But I think, as you said, Michael, there are a number of major areas: the applicability of international law, some of the on-the-ground stuff, some of the committees that study this problem in the UN, and so on. So these 16 resolutions cover all of those. Now, who is introducing these resolutions? Let's talk about that.
Well, it depends. It changes every year. But essentially, most of these resolutions are supported by the international community at large. And you'll find that, maybe this year it's a specific country bringing forward a motion, but a lot of them will be co-sponsored by dozens and dozens of countries. So, which is a testament to how popular they are and how important they are to countries around the world.
Right. My observation is usually there are some Middle Eastern countries who are sponsors of these, but there are also countries from other parts of the world, Europe, South America, so
Sure,
on and
yeah.
so forth. So it's not always the same for each resolution. If you go through the resolutions for this year, the ones who've already been introduced, well, there's a different set of countries for each one of them for the most part. Now, overall, how is Canada's record of voting on these resolutions? Over time, I guess I'm saying.
Well, if you went back 20 years ago under Jean Chrétien, you'd find that Canada was voting in favor of almost all of the ones that we're looking at today, maybe a few abstentions. But then that started to change a little bit under Paul Martin, but it wasn't until really halfway through Stephen Harper's turn when everything really switched. Harper, in the early stages, he started to vote against some of them, introduce new votes, but it was halfway through his term when he dramatically changed Canada's voting universally against all of them except one where there's an abstention.
Right.
And so that was maintained for several years. When Stephen Harper left, Justin Trudeau came in. There was a sense that Canada's back on the world stage, but Justin Trudeau maintained that exact same anti-Palestinian voting record at the UN for a number of years and only made a very small edit to that recently.
Yeah, I guess 2 years ago we started voting differently for one of the resolutions, and we'll get to that. Now, we have CJPME, we have what we call the UN dashboard. You can find it on the CJPME website. And we have all of these 16 resolutions listed all the way going back to, I guess, the beginning of the 2000s. I think 2003, right?
2000, actually.
2000, okay. Now, for all of these resolutions, they all relate to human rights. So when you vote in support of the resolution, you are sort of voting in support of human rights. So a yes vote is sort of good. And so we have in the UN dashboard, we have color coded those as green because it's good to support human rights. And when you vote against it, we color code that as red, that you have voted against that or essentially voted against human rights. When you've abstained, we color code it with gray. And as you look at the UN dashboard, you can sort of scroll back back to 2000 and to the present, and you see sort of all these green votes changing all to red votes, of course, in the Harper years and then continuing in the Trudeau years.
Yeah, it's a pretty stark visual representation of how Canada's voting has changed over time and how under Trudeau, really the Harper legacy of pro-Israel, anti-Palestine voting has been maintained almost entirely. So definitely recommend people go check that out. And it's an interactive resource that you can find a lot of information about how Canada's voting, and we keep it up to date.
That's right. And you can actually click on each resolution on each year and actually see the resolution that was voted on that year. And actually right now, we'll get into a little bit later, we do have some committee votes that have already taken place.
Right.
You can click, even right now, you can click on our UN dashboard for 2021 for those committee votes, and you can actually see those committee resolutions. So let's talk about just a few of let's just focus on 3 resolutions for right now. So, Michael, you brought up the resolution on Palestinian self-determination a moment ago. What is it?
Well, this is a resolution that goes back decades, and it's pretty simple. It reaffirms the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination. This is what happens when you do live streaming. Sometimes you get interrupted. But it's a resolution that reaffirms the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination, including the right to an independent state of Palestine. It's pretty non-controversial, which is why the Canadian government, used to vote in support of it quite uncontroversially. And this year at the committee level, we saw 158 countries, including Canada, vote yes, and only 6 vote no. And so it's a pretty straightforward resolution. This is one where it was 2 years ago, Canada first, partially broke from the Harper era record and voted in favor of this motion, and repeated it last year. And again, at the committee stage this year, they indicated that they will support it again. Yeah. So it's great. It's a nice thing. They should be supporting it, but it's such a drop in the bucket when they're voting against all of these other resolutions.
Right. Absolutely. Well, our apologies, as Michael pointed out, we are streaming live, and we just had a delivery of envelopes, so my apologies for going off camera, but this is what happens, and it's all good. It's all good. We're talking about UN resolutions here and Canada's voting. So that's the Palestinian, the vote on Palestinian self-determination. So we are expecting Canada to continue its trend of voting for that. That's certainly
right.
the indication at the committee level. Another resolution that is worthwhile focusing on right now is, well, there are actually two resolutions that relate to Palestinian refugees, and one specifically on the UN Aid Agency for Palestinian Refugees. It goes by the name of UNRWA, UNRWA, United Nations Relief and Works Agency.
That's right.
UNRWA. So this resolution is sort of important or pertinent because Canada gives a lot of money on an annual basis to UNRWA to support Palestinian refugees, programs on education and health and so on. So why, you would think that Canada would typically support this resolution,
Right.
but I guess that's not the case, is it?
Yeah, so there are millions of Palestinian refugees who receive, essential services from UNRWA as the UN agency. It's really critical, and Canada has for a long time supported UNRWA and given it funding for humanitarian relief. Under Harper, that was sort of taken away for a while, but it was reintroduced under Justin Trudeau's leadership, which is good.
Yeah.
And currently we give it, maybe $25 million a year or so, give or take. Sometimes there's a little top up. As there was after the escalation of violence in May, there was a little bit more money promised to UNRWA, so that's fine. So it's surprising then that you have these two resolutions. One of them is reaffirms the important work that UNRWA does and encourages donor countries to support the agency. That is a resolution that Canada voted against. And then you have another resolution which actually extends the mandate of UNRWA. It has more of a concrete element to it. And that resolution is one that Canada abstained on. So it's so bizarre that Canada is withholding diplomatic support for this agency that it considers important enough to fund to the tune of millions of dollars every year, as it should. So it's baffling.
Yeah, just entirely paradoxical. But we will talk a little bit in a moment about why Canada maybe votes the way that it does, but we'll get to that in a moment. Yeah, it is. It's sad and unfortunate and such a contradiction, I think it's fair to say. Now, there's a resolution also on settlements, and this is interesting as well, in that settlements, I think universally in the international community, are considered an issue. Israel's illegal settlements, we should say. Other people call them colonies because that's literally what they are, that Israel is colonizing portions of the West Bank with Israeli citizens from Israel proper. Universally in the international community, settlements are considered a main impediment to some sort of solution between Israel and the Palestinians. That they take Palestinian land, they deprive Palestinians of resources. There are roads that are created to sort of connect these settlements to one another, which then Palestinians aren't able to use and cross. So nevertheless, even with this resolution, Canada doesn't tend to support it, does it, Michael?
That's right. Again, it's a mystery. Why? Because Canada's official policy is against settlements, considers them a violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention and therefore a war crime. Right. And this resolution, this is another sort of symbolic resolution, but it reaffirms that Israeli settlements are illegal and an obstacle to peace. And it reiterates its demand for the immediate end and cessation of settlement activity. This is something that Canada should support. And yet, when this vote did pass at the committee level a few days ago, 142 countries voted for it, 7 voted against. Canada was one of those 7.
Yeah.
So putting itself in the extreme minority, voting against its own policy, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, it's mind-blowing. I have the Global Affairs Canada official statement on its positions, Canada's positions on the Middle East now related to Israel's illegal settlements. It says Canada does not recognize permanent Israeli control over territories occupied in 1967. It goes on to say, Israeli settlements in the occupied territories are a violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention. The settlements also constitute a serious obstacle to achieving a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace. So that is Canada's official policy. Yet, even on that, they refuse to vote in support of this resolution, which says exactly that.
Yeah, exactly.
So, really surprising. Now, I want to emphasize that we will have a follow-up podcast in December. We'll do a post-mortem on Canada's voting at the UN. We'll have another opportunity to look more closely, and we'll see the final votes. I mean, the committee votes by Canada are certainly a harbinger of what's to come in the plenary votes, but who knows? We'll see if something could change.
Yeah, it indicates how they're going to vote, and it's rarely ever changed between the committee and the plenary stage. But it does provide an opportunity for people who want Canada to take a better position. It gives them a window to put pressure on the government to possibly change that position.
Right, and we will talk about that in a few minutes as well. Now, it's important to note, as you mentioned before, that all of these resolutions passed by a large majority, and often by a huge majority. You mentioned the earlier one. There were 7 opposed and 140 in favor. I mean, this is not atypical with these resolutions.
Right.
Now, and Canada typically falls in the minority position on these, right?
Right.
So, which is just why don't you run through a few facts, Michael, in terms of some of these votes that we see typically?
Well, yeah, I mentioned the settlement vote was 142 to 7, and that is pretty consistent. On that one, you have 16 abstentions, and that is what it is. But a lot of these are even more lopsided. There was the one on assistance to Palestine refugees. 160 countries voted yes. There was 1 no, Israel, and 9 abstentions where Canada abstained along with the United States. So again, it doesn't make any sense, and it puts us in this extreme minority. This is the common balance of power on these votes. Usually the ones who vote no alongside Canada is the United States. You have sometimes Hungary or sometimes Australia. And then you have the Marshall Islands, Micronesia, Nauru, small island countries that depend a lot on the political support of the United States. And so there's some sort of political favor or influence that is happening to explain that. But it's essentially a handful of countries against the rest of the world.
Right. And maybe in December we can talk about, talk a little bit more about those countries that the names tend to appear again and again, among them being 4 small island nations in the Pacific, which I think between them have no more than a few 100,000 people.
And if you took those out, if you remove them from the equation, it would usually be the rest of the world against Israel, the United States, and Canada.
Yeah, which is really tragic, honestly. Now, I think, Michael, you and I would agree that Canada's voting should go in a little slightly different direction, a much different direction at the UN. And I think here at CJPME, we have pillars, the founding pillars of CJPME are based around international law. So that's obviously would be one thing that we would expect to see from Canada, that, support for international law and the rule of law. Now, the Canadian government gives a lot of lip service to the rule of law, but it actually means supporting resolutions at the UN, which assert international law. So Canada is really failing to live up to sort of its own sort of stated in lip service to international law. A second pillar of CJPME is that violence should not be, it's not a solution, and it shouldn't be favored or rewarded. And to some degree, Canada's voting patterns at the UN to some degree reward Israel for its belligerence. It's colonizing territory. It's acquiring territory by force. It's imposing this occupation through, garrisons of soldiers and so on in occupied Palestinian territory. So Israel's violence is being rewarded. We don't believe that Canada's voting should support that. We believe that parties should be pressured to change. This is a status quo. Sometimes people say it's been going on so long. Why has it been going on so? Partly because we let it go on so long, and there's no pressure. There's no real pressure on, say, Israel to bring an end to its occupation. And one of the things that I often bring up with this is, where's the sense of urgency? This has been going on a long time. There are a lot of people suffering as a result of this. You mentioned earlier with the Palestinian refugees, there's 5 million registered refugees today. They're living in temporary homes. They're living in refugee camps, often in very, very squalid conditions. Millions of people are being impacted by the international community's refusal to sort of intervene meaningfully in this. So I think, would you agree, Michael, that these should be some of the guiding principles in terms of Canada's voting?
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't want to belabor the point too much, but again, these resolutions that Canada is voting against reflect Canada's own official position to a significant extent, which itself is aligned with international consensus.
Yeah.
So the idea that we have this idea of Canada having sort of a balanced position, of sort of like a fair position in the world, but that's not the way it's acting.
No, certainly not. Certainly not. Now, what are Canada's justifications when it takes a minority role on these votes? Now, there are a few things that you see again and again and again, aren't there? There's sort of this tendency to sort of say, well, the resolutions are one-sided. So Canadian diplomats at the UN will say, well, this resolution was too one-sided and we didn't want to vote for it because it was one-sided. Sometimes they make the point, we feel that these resolutions are not helpful in advancing peace. And these Canada votes against regardless of the merit of these resolutions. How do you feel about these justifications, Michael?
Well, that's exactly it. I mean, Canada is essentially saying that, regardless of whether these resolutions match our own policy, we're going to vote against them as a bloc because they're seen as one-sided, or as a whole, the UN is singling out Israel for criticism. Obviously, that is ridiculous. On one hand, we should not be aiming for balance. The situation is not balanced.
No,
it's not one of two equal parties, but of an occupation and an occupied population. It is one-sided.
Right.
And so it does not make sense to put that kind of a standard on how Canada votes.
Yeah. Sometimes I sort of say, let's say you had someone that was a serial shoplifter, that they were going into stores again and again and again and shoplifting. And so every time they shoplifted, you accuse them of a crime. You say, well, Joe, you've shoplifted again. Here's another accusation. I sort of feel it's a bit like that year after year after year, Israel continues to commit these same abuses. And then they complain when year after year after year they're held to account. There are attempts to hold them account.
Right. And that's the mandate of the United Nations, is to uphold international law. You have a situation of a violation of international law, of an occupation, of settlements, of breaches of the Fourth Geneva Convention that have been going on for more than half a century. Right. So what do you expect the United Nations to do? It should be upholding these principles, and to try to put this standard that the world should blame the occupied and the occupier equally is absolutely absurd. And just it's awful. I hate it.
Or the sort of sense that these resolutions should just go away.
Right.
Which is, if you're going to vote against them every single time, then that's sort of the message you're giving is this resolution is irrelevant. But in fact, this is one of the main ways that the international community can actually put pressure on Israel.
Right, and once the occupation ends, a lot of these resolutions are going to go away. If you want there to be less votes about Palestine refugees, then you compensate them. You respect their right to return. You end the refugee crisis. That is how this gets to a resolution. And it's not that dissimilar than how South Africa used to complain about being singled out on the international stage. All of these resolutions every year against apartheid, a special committee against apartheid, all of this attention. But those went away when apartheid ended. And we can expect the same thing when Israeli apartheid ends, I think. So that should be the focus. The focus, if you really want these resolutions to go away, don't vote against them and protect Israel from criticism, but work to actually end the situation that they're responding
the conditions that lead to these resolutions. Exactly. Now, the big question that we haven't gotten to yet, we're coming to an end here, but the big question that we haven't addressed, and we won't try to go into too much detail because we do have our December podcast to dig into this a little bit more. But why do we think Canada votes the way that it does?
Well, I don't think there's a good answer for this, but there's a lot of different factors. Obviously, we have to consider that there are political actors who are very well organized, who pro-Israel groups are very vocal on this issue. And we saw, even when Canada voted for Palestinian self-determination the past couple of years, even though Canada is 90% voting with Israel against all of these resolutions, you had all of these groups come out and say that Canada's turning its back on Israel. How dare you do this?
Well, and also as if supporting Palestinian self-determination is somehow against Israel.
Exactly.
You want both peoples to be, self-determining and so on. So it's sort of mind-blowing as way that somehow something it's like a zero-sum game for Israel, or at least these pro-Israel advocates, that anything that sort of supports Palestinian rights or supports Palestinian refugees is somehow against Israel, which is not at all the case.
Right. So those voices that are anti these resolutions are very loud. The government listens to them, and the government tends to ignore the voices of others like Palestinian Canadians, Arab Canadians who have a very different position on this, and just people who support human rights. Those, those of us who think that Canada should be upholding international law at the UN, we have very little voice with this government.
Yeah. And it's probably fair to say partly because the voices for international law and social justice are not quite as powerful, in Canadian society. And so we have to, I think, strengthen our electoral influence, strengthen our political influence. So as long as we're a less significant factor for politicians, they can afford to ignore us. So that's part of the thing CJPME exists to change, obviously. So wrapping up, what is the expected rollout of these votes coming up in the next few weeks?
Well, we're already well into the committee stage where about 6 of these resolutions have already passed the initial step of being adopted by these committees. And then we'll go to the plenary for a final vote. And usually that wraps up by the middle of December or near the end of December. So we'll be following this for the next month and a bit and keeping people informed about whether or not Canada is upholding human rights or not.
Exactly. And just to reiterate, we are tracking all this, day to day on our UN dashboard that you can find on the CJPME website. That's cjpme.org. We will be launching a campaign or two in the coming weeks to encourage the government to vote in support of 1 or 2 of these resolutions that we'd really like to see them change their vote on. So these campaigns will be an opportunity for average Canadians, listeners, to make their representatives in Parliament know that they want Canada to take a more principled position on these resolutions.
Yeah, and a lot of these campaigns, they really take only 10 seconds to put together an email, send it to maybe the Trudeau's cabinet, to key diplomats, to the foreign affairs critics of opposition parties, so that everyone who needs to know is informed and they can't ignore this as an issue. Exactly.
So we really do encourage people, if you get an email from us asking you to support one of those campaigns, we really encourage you to participate. Those campaigns really do make a difference. So there'll be lots of updates in the coming weeks, and people can follow us or follow the developments on the UN dashboard. So we'll leave it at that, and we'll hope that the Trudeau government has a crisis of conscience in the coming days and starts the vote in a way which is more aligned with international law and the true urgency of the need. As I mentioned earlier, we will have a follow-up podcast once all the voting is done to see where the chips have fallen, and especially with Canada's votes. So that's our conversation for today. Thank you for joining us. If you've liked our podcast today, please subscribe to our channel. We're on all the major audio podcast platforms, in addition to YouTube, of course. If you can, please leave a positive review wherever you get your podcasts. It helps other people to find our program and learn about the issues. If you have any comments, questions, or suggestions, we always love to hear from our listeners and supporters. You can feel free to email us at info@cjpme.org. Thanks to all of our supporters who make this podcast possible, as well as making all our other activities possible. Thanks also to Madeleine Moffat, our podcast engineer and consultant. And that's it for now. We look forward to having you all with us for our next podcast. Take care, and we'll see you again soon.